Welcome, everybody. It's nine o'clock. We started roughly at 9 o'clock. And today we have Jane Noah, return visit. I think it's been about 3 years since you've been here. Yeah, COVID canceled a lot of stuff. And we're doing this in-house, as you can plainly see. And we're also doing it on Zoom, and we have about 20 connections out there. So when you total this, we count the numbers in here, and then we do the additional out there. We're still taking our grand $2 dues. And if you have not paid, we appreciate it if you would. Then make sure you bring your GVR card next time, and we'll just scan you in. And that's GVR's requirement. We have to take some kind of attendance. So that's why we scan in the cards and so forth. And Chris, our wonderful friend in the back, is also counting it, and we share the count so everything goes. And doing Zoom and in-house is sometimes a challenge. So we hope it's working. I am recording it. I have permission to record it. So if somebody out there wants to hear the recording, it should be on our website by the weekend. And with that, our famous private eye, who's been here before and is doing today 10 typical PI cases. And make sure that's on.
I believe it's on.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Yeah, it's on.
Jane Noah. And here you go, Jane.
Morning. We have a great group considering you had to slop around in the weather. My husband said I had to run between the drops to get here. So that's a problem. I can't see the screen. I mean, I can see the screen, but I can't see the little button. Can we turn it down part way? I don't have a clicker, so I have to be able to see the right arrow on here. Yeah. Well, let me start talking. You're seeing a picture of my former business partner and me. We got together with our spouses for a little visit this summer, and we always have a great time. Of course, they do a lot of reminiscing, and that's what I'm going to be doing today is reminiscing. Does that help me? Thank you. Yeah, I think it will. And so we're going to tell you some of the variety of things that we did in our agency. We were in Denver, Boulder, and Albuquerque. And Bob had come from law enforcement and I came from journalism. So we had different skills, different contacts, and we worked very well together. And at the largest, our agency had about 12 people, which is very large for Denver, small compared to other places. And we did all of our work for trial lawyers. It's okay to turn the lights off, I think. Got my hand on the button. Let's, okay. So we're going to start telling you that the pictures you're seeing are only for illustration. They're not the real people, but they look very much like the real people. It's giving you the flavor of it. I'm going to start with a fraud case. One of my lawyer clients represented businesses, and he called me about, or brought me in for a meeting about a auto dealer that had a problem. It was a Saturday afternoon, late in the day, when a very well-spoken, well-dressed man walked into an auto dealership to buy a new sports car. He picked out the top of the line. He said he would get cash from his bank on Monday morning, and he wanted to do the paperwork then so he could put the car in the name of his fiancée. She was flying in from Paris on Sunday. He wanted to go to the airport to pick her up in her new car. And the two salesmen were pretty excited about this sale. But he didn't give them a $5,000 deposit on a credit card. He didn't bring in a trade-in. He wanted to take the car on Saturday afternoon when he couldn't access his bank and wait till Monday morning to take care of things. Well, the salesman just didn't see how that was going to work. And he said, "Oh, gentlemen, I can understand your concern. So I brought some collateral with me." He reached into his coat pocket and he pulled out a certificate of authenticity. Well, here's our car dealership. A certificate of authenticity for the Pearl of India. Now, this is no ordinary pearl. It's about 6 inches tall and almost 4 inches wide, and it weighed 5 pounds. He said it was been in his family for many years and he recently inherited it. He assured these 2 car salesmen that it was worth well over $500,000. And he gave them the papers to hold until he returned on Monday. Oh my gosh, I asked the lawyer, did they let him take the car? Oh yes, and I'll never understand why they didn't at least call a manager to get authorization. And of course, the customer didn't come back on Monday or Tuesday. We have his driver's license, so on Wednesday, the manager of the dealership went out to his house to pick up the car, but he doesn't live at that address anymore. So the lawyer wanted us to locate the customer. And he also needed to know, was there any value in the Pearl of India? Whoops, I'm sorry. So one of my other investigators started working on locating the guy. And I used an international newspaper search to see if there'd been anything ever written about the Pearl of India. And evidently, it had been bought and sold many times. Twice it was won in a poker game, or at least the certificate of authenticity was won in a poker game. Do you need something? I found 3 lawsuits with people each claiming ownership of the pearl, and none of them were in the United States. I couldn't tell where the pearl might be at that time and whether the Denver guy had ever even seen it. Now, we did find a current address for the man. The luxury car was recovered, and the customer, or should we say car thief, was convicted of motor vehicle theft. He was sued for fraud, but the car dealership didn't recover any of the money because this well-to-do man was actually bankrupt. And by the way, he did not have a fiance either. Now, another big area where we did work besides business cases was personal injury auto accidents. And we would work for the lawyers who were representing whoever got injured in the accident. And so we would start with a police report to get and read the witness statements, look at the police photographs and the diagrams of the scene. And then we would look for anything else. Could we find more eyewitnesses? What was the weather? What about sun glare? Were there any road hazards? But one of my very first auto cases involved a teenage driver without a license. This kid, Jeff, was 16 and he had just gotten his learner's permit. His parents had to go out of town for about a week, so Jeff was going to stay with his Aunt Judy on her farm at the edge of town. And the plan was for her to take him to high school and then pick him up in the afternoon. But she had an unusually busy time at her work in town, and she decided to let Jeff use her old Jeep, the Jeep that she only drove around the farm, the one that didn't have any insurance on it. So on Tuesday, Jeff and his friend Billy were returning to Aunt Judy's farm after school, and they weren't speeding. They were just on the main road, leading, not a busy road, like a 2-lane. And they saw a stray horse along the side of the road. They didn't think much about it. And then suddenly they heard loud noises, and the horse spooked and ran right in front of the Jeep. And Jeff swerved to avoid the horse, but he drove into a ditch and he collided with a tree. The passenger side of the Jeep was badly damaged, and his friend Billy suffered a broken arm and collarbone. And of course, both of them were cut by some flying glass. Billy, the passenger, got his medical bills taken care of by his own family's auto insurance. But then that company turned around and sued the driver, Jeff, and his parents and his Aunt Judy to recover their costs. And So our boy Jeff's parents hired a lawyer who called me, and we couldn't find any insurance coverage for Jeff. He wasn't licensed yet, so he wouldn't be on his parents' policy. I'm sorry. Get to that, I promise. Here's our horse. Aunt Judy didn't carry any insurance because she just used the Jeep around the farm. And, but of course she had some liability because it was her vehicle and she'd loaned it to him. Well, then we have the stray horse. Who owned it and why was it running loose? Had to canvass the neighborhood to find out about the horse, but it belonged to a fellow named Jim Ryder, and he boarded it with two brothers. One owned the farm and the other was a horse trainer, and they offered riding lessons and took care of the animals. So on the day of this accident, one of the brothers had taken this horse out for exercise, but before he could get it back into its stall, he got distracted by something, and the horse was just in a pasture area. But evidently the fence was down, and the horse managed to wander off and go down the road. And then the horse was spooked by some loud noise. By talking to all the neighbors, I learned there was another farmer nearby named Homer who was pretty angry that day about a flock of crows that had gathered outside his kitchen door. And they just carried on for an hour. And Homer got so upset about it that he got his shotgun. And he went outside, fired a few shots up in the air to chase the crows away. And of course, he didn't know there was a loose horse out on the highway. And the horse got frightened and ran in front of the Jeep. So this is what we have. My job is to find the proximate cause of an accident. That's the most immediate cause. Without this event, would there have been an accident? Well, it's a little hard because Billy's injuries were caused by his friend Jeff, who driving Aunt Judy's car, and it went into a ditch because of the horse running in front of the car, and the horse was loose because they didn't have fixed their broken fence. And then the neighbor shoots off the gun, and I laid all this out to the lawyer, and he shook his head and he said, "This liability is like a law school problem." And I honestly do not know how it was solved, but I know it never went to a trial. And I believe that somehow the parties negotiated a settlement in this. And that's the most common thing in most lawsuits, that there will be some kind of a settlement. Now, another area that we did a lot of work in is premise liability. Premise liability is when somebody slips and falls on your front steps, or they get injured in a store, or maybe they're robbed in a hotel, and whoever owns the premises may have some liability for it. In this case, we had a injured person, we'll call him Richard. He was a sales rep from the East Coast, came to Denver on business. He stayed in a hotel, had to do a little work in the evening, got a little room service dinner. About 8 o'clock, he wandered down the block to a neighborhood bar. He was just going to have a beer, and he goes into this bar. It looks okay. It's even got a bouncer at the door, and he's going to watch a pro basketball game and just have a beer up at the counter. So he's sitting at the bar with chatting with the guy next to him about basketball, like guys will do. And then all of a sudden, these two guys hear loud voices, and they swiveled around on their bar stools to see two angry, drunken men in a scuffle. The bartender and the bouncer jumped in to intervene, and during the struggle, one man tried to attack the bouncer, who then shoved him away and shoved him right into Richard, who was knocked off his bar stool, hitting his head on the edge of the bar and landing on the floor. So police came, ambulances came. Richard spent a couple days in the hospital, had surgery on his wrist and treatment for a concussion and a sprained neck. And he hired a personal injury law firm that we did a lot of work for. And they showed us the reports. The bouncer and the bartender told the police that Richard was hurt in the bar fight, which makes it sound like he was one of the people fighting. So he said, no, I was just sitting there. So what I did is I went to the police department and got the 911 calls that came in from that incident. And you can hear the calls and also see the dispatcher's cards. They fill out one, and every call comes in, they're writing down or typing today. The name of the person, you know, what's your name? Where are you right now? What's your phone number? And that kind of thing. So we had 5 witnesses who'd called 911. And the best one was the fella sitting right next to him. And so I interviewed each of them, and the young man sitting next to Richard said, no, he wasn't doing nothing. We were just sitting there talking. We turned around and see what's happening. He gets knocked to the floor, and it was very clear where the liability was. And then another thing I would do for a case like this is get the liquor licensing file, which is a public record, and look to see were there other incidents at this bar, and who owned it, and the kind of details that the law firm needed for their law case. And you don't normally file a case like this right away. Wait till the injured person has all of their medical bills in, including any physical therapy or follow-up, and know how much work they missed and that type of thing. But it was a successful case, and another one that was really settled out of court. So we're going to move on to the missing person. And these are the most challenging because, you know, it just tugs at your heartstrings. This is one example where private investigators often will work with police agencies. Normally, police detectives don't welcome any outside input or interference. They have their own methods and their own skills, and they really don't want outsiders involved. But when you have something like a missing person, it's not unusual to have cooperation. Another example could be some business fraud cases. So in this case, and while you're looking at Tara Thompson's picture, think to yourself what ethnicity you think she might be. Okay. So this case came to us through her grandmother. Grandmother contacted the family lawyer after Tara had been missing for more than a week. And the police had pointed out that some young people just take off. But grandmother was sure that something had happened to her. She finally went to her family lawyer, and he brought us in on it. She told us that Tara had been adopted at the age of 4. She'd been an orphan from the big Iran earthquake that killed 20,000 people. So she was actually Iranian. And her new parents were diplomats with careers in the US Foreign Service. So that she grew up at embassies in various parts of the world and was educated largely in private schools. She was not a great student. She was a wonderful personality, outgoing, loved people, rather artistic, but not real academic. She chose not to go to college. Her favorite relative was this grandmother because she had often visited her in Boulder in the summers. And so when she was out of school, she chose to go to Boulder, and she enrolled in a beauty school. Very interested in doing that. And she had lived in a house that she shared with a girl she knew from her summers there, her friend Lori. They had a little rented house. And of course, we talked to Lori. Lori had gone with the grandmother to the police, and she came with the grandmother to the meeting at the lawyer's office. The last time she saw Tara was on a Saturday night. She was getting ready to go out dancing. Tara loved to go to the bars and go drinking and dancing, and she'd sing along with the band, and she was friendly and flirty. Usually she came home when the bars closed about 2 a.m. But once in a while, Tara would stay out all night. So her roommate wasn't totally alarmed until about noon on Sunday. And then she started calling the cell phone, but there was no answer. Lori called 2 girls that she knew Tara usually was with at the bars. They didn't know where she was. So at that point, Lori went ahead and notified Tara's grandmother. And by Monday morning, they were so worried that that's where they went to the police. And the police used their computer to call up a driver's license picture of Tara. And they agreed, yeah, that looked pretty much like her. And They put out a bulletin for Colorado law enforcement to watch for her car, the Volkswagen. And a week later, there were still no leads. And that's when the grandmother came to the lawyer. And she just knew something bad had happened. She and Lori both told us that Tara would not go anywhere by herself. She wouldn't drive from Boulder to Denver, which is just like going from Green Valley to Tucson. Not a long ways at all. Good road, but she wouldn't go. She would drive a little ways into the mountains once in a while and sit in a pretty place and write poetry. But that's the only thing she would do by herself. So the fact that she was gone and her car was gone was so alarming to them. And then I went to the house and met with Lori in more depth because I figured she might tell me some things that she didn't say in front of the grandmother. And I learned a little bit more about Tara's habits and friends. But mostly we were looking through her room. The only thing that could be identified as missing was a pair of white leather moccasins. She liked to go dancing in those. And Lori couldn't recognize anything else that wasn't there. But at least we thought maybe the moccasins were with her. And we found her credit card on top of her desk. One way to trace missing people is the police can ask the credit card agencies, not the credit card companies. They all have fraud investigators, and they will check to see if there's any use on a credit card for a person who's been missing a while like this in a suspicious way. But her credit card was right there on her desk. She did carry some cash with her, and she also often had some cash in the glove box of her car. I asked Lori if there was any change at all in Tara's appearance. And she said, well, since she started the beauty school, she had added a white streak in her hair, just decoratively, you know. So that did not show on the photo. And I said, anything else? And she said, well, you know, when we were at the police department, they had her driver's license on the screen, and it said she was 5'2". Tara's not even 5 feet tall. She's about 4'11", and she's very sensitive about being so small. So she always claims she's 5'1" or 5'2". I said, okay. And I said, any other identifying marks or anything? And she said, yes, she has a small tattoo on her right shoulder, and it's the bluebird of happiness. So I got back to the detective in Boulder and told her these other details about Tara. I went through, I don't believe I ever mentioned the difference in the height, but I said she had a tattoo and that she did not go off by herself at all, except to write poetry in the mountains. And then the detective asked the other agencies, the county sheriff and the state patrol, to check for this car in any outlying areas, but there still was no sign. So there's the grandmother and the lawyer, very concerned about this. Police department, the sheriff and police out, very cooperative, looking at any pretty place where Tara might have stopped, no sign of her. There's the detective bureau. A couple of days later, I was back in this detective bureau on a completely different case, talking to someone else. And the woman on Tara's case waved at me from across the room. And she said, Jane, I've got a detective from Duluth, Minnesota on the phone. She called us today. They have a homicide victim who is a young female. There's no identification on the body, but there's a matchbook from a Boulder bar in her pocket. And I said, you know, that could be Tara. And the detective said, well, I don't think so, because the coroner says their victim is a Hispanic female. And she's only 4'11", and we know Tara is 5'2". You can change your hair color, you can change your weight, but you sure can't change your height. And I said, well, you know, I can explain that. I think Lori forgot to tell you or didn't know it would matter, but Tara was so sensitive about her height. She's only 4'11", but she claimed to be 5'2". Well, the detective returned to her phone call and she said, I have a private investigator here who's helping the family look for our missing Boulder girl. She has some details that might match up for you. And she put me on the phone. And the Duluth detective told me that their victim's body was found alongside a road outside Duluth, the highway, and the body was clothed and wrapped in a blue blanket. Now, those facts are significant because when a body is wrapped with care and placed where it will surely be found, that's usually put there by somebody who actually knew the victim, not a stranger who just attacked and killed in a few minutes. So I gave the Duluth detective all the details that I could. I said, I understand your victim looks to be Hispanic, but Tara Thompson was born in Iran. She has very dark hair and large brown eyes. She's 4'11", but claimed to be 5 feet. Her roommate thinks she was wearing her favorite white leather moccasins when she disappeared. I heard the detective inhale a sharp breath. And when I mentioned the moccasins, there was a little silence because she didn't say anything. I added that Tara was in beauty school and had dyed a blonde streak in her dark hair. And I described the small tattoo of a bluebird of happiness on her right shoulder. Oh, the detective said, I thought it was a butterfly. And that's when I knew that our missing person had been found, 11 days after she disappeared. Duluth issued a nationwide alert for Tara's Volkswagen, but it wasn't found by law enforcement. A week later, the Boulder detective called me back. We got him, she said. There was a woman in Danbury, Connecticut, who reported that an old boyfriend turned up at her place, and he stayed with her a few days, and he was acting very strangely. He was driving a car with Colorado license plates, but he'd been working at some job in California and got fired, and she knew he started hitchhiking across the country. But here he shows up in Connecticut with this Colorado car. He got to drinking too much one night, which was common for him. And when he passed out, the woman went through the billfold and found the insurance card of a Colorado woman. She immediately called 911. So the man was arrested. He didn't say where he never admitted that he killed anybody or dumped a body. But because we were able to match up through the cooperation with the Detective Bureau, they were able to tie him to Duluth and, to this particular case. And he was convicted of auto theft, kidnapping, and murder. And, it's a tragedy, but it would have been worse if that body in Duluth had never been identified. And if the person who was suspected of causing it might not have been convicted because it's so hard to prove a case without a body. So it had legally a successful outcome. And I think that it was just such good fortune that I happened to be in the Detective Bureau for something else when the call came in from Duluth. Some things are meant to be. So probably the most common case for private investigators in general is doing insurance fraud work for insurance companies. Unfortunately, a lot of people claim to have an injury or a lingering injury long after it is healed because they're getting some decent payments for that. And they're a little reluctant to give it up. And I'm sorry there's so many dishonest people because it just costs the system more money that other victims really need. But we didn't do that work. We were working for plaintiff attorneys. But one of our colleagues worked with us from time to time. And another former reporter named Michael Stone did do quite a bit of work for insurance companies. And he called me for some advice one day because he was trying to think through how to approach this problem case. He was supposed to be checking on a woman that had gotten injured in an auto accident. And she was disabled, at least temporarily. She was getting monthly payments from an insurance company. And her last medical report indicated she was healing, but she still couldn't lift anything over 10 pounds or do any kind of vigorous exercise. The insurance company heard she might have returned to her job, so they wanted Michael Stone to check on that and see if she was still disabled, as she claimed. Well, commonly we'd watch the front door and watch somebody come out of their house and get in a car and follow them and see where they're going. But this woman lived in a high-rise apartment in central Denver with an underground parking garage. And so he didn't have any way to watch her, and he didn't even have a photograph of her. So he lived in the same neighborhood. And Mike's plan was to send this young woman, Jennifer, a guest gift certificate to the Cherry Creek Athletic Club. It's a great athletic club. He belonged to it. He was there all the time. Fancy place. They've got everything you can imagine. And he thought, well, even if she's still disabled, at least maybe he could see her. She might be using their swimming pool for physical therapy or doing some other prescribed exercises. Or she might be doing something more active. And I said, well, wait a minute, Mike, that's a good plan, but don't send her a gift certificate until you know whether or not she's a member. Because most of the single people working in Central Denver, if they had any means at all, joined the Cherry Creek Athletic Club. That's where you met the guys. So, or the girls, depending. So he said, well, that's a good idea. Now, Mike is a real tall, good looking guy, and he's very personable. And he'd already chatted many times with a woman who worked at the front desk. So he wandered in there and, chewed the fat with her and mentioned the name of this Jennifer Wilson. Said, I was kind of hoping to run into her someday over here. Is she signed up for any classes or anything? And the girl at the desk smiled and said she'd check. She looks at her computer and she says, oh yeah, here she is. She has reserved a racquetball court. Saturday morning, 8 a.m. It's court number 3. Now, Jennifer Wilson is a common name. Do you want to look at her picture, see if it's the right person? So she spins the computer around and he looks at it. He says, sure. He's never seen Jennifer Wilson, but he's hoping, and he's definitely going to check it out. So at 8 a.m., 2 young women enter the court number 3. And Mike's able to watch because there's a gallery where you sit up above the court and look down on it. And he can see them playing their game. And he figured out the blonde was probably Jennifer Wilson. He saw her moving around the court with ease, actually playing quite a vigorous athletic game of racquetball. And he took video for his client. And after the game, the 2 women went to the juice bar to have some refreshments. And Mike got himself a bottle of water and sat at a table nearby. And he was trying to think of a way to engage them in conversation when he overheard Jennifer talking about how she thought she would probably leave her job. And she mentioned the company she worked for, and then he knew it was the right person. So he reported his findings to the insurance company's lawyers. At that point, the procedure would be to call her in for a new medical exam with one of the insurance company's doctors. And they decided she was fit and really didn't need any further disability payments. The field of process serving gives us a lot of work. Most process serving is done by sheriff's deputies, in some areas by constables, and by process servers, who that's all they do. And most of it's very simple. You walk up to the person at their home or their office, and you give them a subpoena to appear in court for a summons and complaint or as a witness, and you're done. But sometimes that doesn't work because people are being elusive. And then the law firms would call us and pay our regular hourly rate, which is considerably higher, to have us make multiple attempts until we got it done. And that one was a business case where the law firm had been unable to serve the CEO. He had a receptionist and a secretary and an executive assistant, and each of them was a gatekeeper that kept people from getting to the inner office. So our guy, Rob Erickson, dressed up like a maintenance man. Rob even got himself a ladder, and he got his hard hat, and he walked right past those 3 women, get into the back office as if he was going to change the lights in the ceiling. And instead he hands the papers for the summons and complaint to the CEO sitting behind his desk, and that took care of it right there. Then I had a case where law firm wanted me to serve divorce papers on a fella, and the process server couldn't find him. He had moved out of the family home 6 months earlier. He was living with a girlfriend somewhere. He had a new job. somewhere. So I talked to the ex-wife and I said, well, what's his routine? Does he go to the Olive Garden for dinner every Friday night? Or does he belong to an Elks Lodge? She said his only activity was a Tuesday night bowling league. That works for me. I like bowling leagues. Because you know where they're going to be, and they've got their jackets and their shirts, and they might even have their name on the shirt. So it's not hard to know who's who. I went there, I watched the league bowling, and I waited till the end because I was a league bowler myself at that time. I didn't want to mess up his average by serving him the papers. One of our biggest specialties was criminal defense. And it's difficult, but it's challenging. And often there's more to the story than what happened in the police reports. They're dealing with what happened today, what information they can get immediately, and then they have to move on to the cases. And we have the time to go back and find additional witnesses and other factors that might play a part. And in any event, defense attorneys have an ethical responsibility to investigate, to be thorough, because you can't have a proper defense for someone if you don't understand the case. So even if our investigation showed that the accused person was just exactly as guilty as charged, it was still important to have that investigation. So in this case, it started at a Super Bowl party. And our defendant was Clifford. He is charged with attempted murder and assault with a deadly weapon. He stabbed a friend during the Super Bowl party at a house, and he had no real explanation for what set him off. Now, Clifford was a computer whiz. He was probably a genius, but he was known for being really short-tempered and having some trouble dealing with people. He'd gone to this party with his wife, who is the most patient person on this earth, and they went to the same Super Bowl party with the same friends every year. One couple had a big house, they had a nice big setup where they had plenty of seating, including a big sectional sofa, big screen TV, and they would buy the ham for the party, and everybody else brought side dishes and beer, and it was, a good party. So during this party, when Clifford saw his wife talking to another man, he grabbed the carving knife from the buffet table and he stabbed the victim in the throat. Suddenly there was blood everywhere and people were screaming. Two men managed to grab Clifford and get that knife away from him without getting hurt. And a woman who was a nurse acted very quickly to slow the bleeding while the others called 911. A fast response from the ambulance crew and really good work in the emergency room saved the life of the victim. So Clifford was arrested and he was held in jail and was without bond. And the public defender was assigned to his case, and because he didn't have a high income. And so they did a good investigation. Colorado, we have an excellent public defender system. They have good investigators. They talked to everybody who was at the party. They got all the background on the victim, whose name was Kenny. Kenny and his wife owned a hair salon in town. They didn't find anything negative about them. And they just pretty much did everything they could do. But about that time, Clifford's parents stepped in. They weren't satisfied. They thought he's going to be going to prison for the rest of his life, and we have to at least try further. So they hired a private attorney who brought us in, and he and I looked at the reports. And as I said, the public defender had done, their investigators did a good job. And we knew that the victim, Kenny, and his wife had this upscale hair salon. They were known as congenial. They were well regarded. And the attorney said, Clifford's family knows he's not going to walk away from this. He's going to pay a penalty, but they're hoping to mitigate it in some way. And we're going to have our own psychiatric examination. We're going to try to negotiate something with a fairly short prison term and ongoing probation, very strict, so he can't hurt anybody else without going back to prison. And of course, plenty of effective mental health treatment for him. And I don't know what else we could do. And I said, well, I think we should go talk to the victim. let's find out what Kenny wants to see from this case. Is it important to him that this man that he knows, Clifford, he knows him quite well, is it important to him that he goes to prison for the rest of his life? Or would he be willing to consider some kind of a arrangement other than a long term? And the attorney argued with me. He said, hey, this guy almost died. You think he's going to talk to you? And I said, well, we're not going to find out unless we try. So I had heard from some of these mutual friends that Kenny was recovering from his terrible injury and was expected to get back to work. And so I went to the hair salon in the middle of a quiet weekday, and he was there. And I introduced myself to Kenny. There we go. It was a real nice place that they had. And I told Kenny who I was, that I was working for the attorney representing Clifford, and that I just didn't think that the police report explained what caused Clifford's attack on him. And I'd really like to talk to him about it and get his input. And Kenny invited me right in. He took me to a back office. And right away, he said, I appreciate you coming here to talk to me in person. The other investigators talked to everybody that ever knew me, trying to dig up dirt about me. And they didn't ask me for any input myself to find out what I have to say. And I said, believe me, we care about what you have to say. The attorney and I have been worried about your injuries. I'm glad to see you're able to return to work. And I'd like to hear your side of this. And he said, well, he knew Clifford was somewhat unstable, but they always got along. And they just been sitting there watching TV, watching the game. And during the game, Clifford went up to go to the buffet table to get some more food. And the announcer on TV was talking about matriculating the ball down the field. And this, Kenny knew that Cliff's wife was an English teacher. So he turns to her and says, you think that guy ever matriculated in college? And she laughed a little bit, and that's when he got stabbed with the knife. So Clifford just remembered that there was blood and screaming and this flurry of activity with the nurse and everybody trying to help him. Here's his scar. He said, he showed me a scar. He said, I almost died. I lost so much blood. I marveled at his ability to survive. I said, he must be a person with a very strong spirit. And he said, yes. And I asked him what kind of outcome he wants to see from this case. And Kenny said, you know, my wife and I have talked about that more than once. We've known Clifford and we know he has problems. We really don't think he ought to be going to prison for the rest of his life. He's a really talented computer guy. If he could just be stable and not be a risk to anybody. But on the other hand, it was serious and I did almost die. And I think that he should have consequences. And I said, I agree. And so does his attorney. And we're going to look at the possibility of a relatively short prison term, followed maybe 1 or 2 years, followed by at least 5 years of probation with continuing psychiatric treatment. And he said, I think we could live with that. And when it came down to it, he wrote that opinion in his victim impact statement for the prosecutor. And in the meantime, the attorney worked on the details, and that is the way the case worked out for Clifford. And his family was very thankful that he did not spend another 20, 30 years in prison, but did have to be held accountable. So another field we do a lot of work in is adoptee searches. And I really recommend that adoptees use a private investigator or some other intermediary, because one time I had a person where she wanted me to track down her birth mother. I found the woman, and this gal insisted on calling the mother herself, and the mother was very suspicious. Are you after our estate? Do you want some kind of money from us? And she got rejected a second time. In that case, she did eventually connect with a sibling, a half sister, and they became good friends, but she never had a relationship with her birth mother. This turned out to be the mother of a good friend of one of my sons. He had come to me when he was about 25, and I'd known this boy growing up. He'd been at our house a number of times, nice fella, had gone to college, got married, had a new baby. He was a athletic, good-looking guy, and he was a commercial real estate salesman. And he knew he was adopted, and when he was 25, his adoptive parents supported him in his search. And he got the name of a woman in California through one of the agencies that helps adoptees find each other, but he couldn't find an address for her. And he sent a letter, but it was marked no one at this address or moved away. So that's when he came to me and said, can you help? And I said, sure. And I tracked her down and I got her on the phone. And I said, my name is Jane and I'm calling you from Colorado. And I'm a private investigator. And I think maybe a relative of yours is looking for you. She said, that must be my son. I said, yes, it is. And I've known him since he was a teenager. He's a really fine young man. And he would like to be in touch with you. And she said, I have no other relatives left. My parents passed away. My two brothers have died. I have no other children. I've been married 20 years now. And my husband knows I gave up a child for adoption before we ever met. And I would really like to be in touch. And I said, well, he would like to meet you. And she said, but I'm not what he would expect. I know that people looking for adoptive parents have their fantasies about them. And I'm in very poor health. I'm only 47, but I'm disabled. I'm very much overweight. I have multiple health issues. I had to leave my job. And that's why we moved to a smaller town with lower expenses. And I'm afraid he'll be disappointed. And I said, you know, this young man is a person of character, and he's been thoughtful about approaching finding his birth mother. He'll be thrilled that we have found you. Let's let you get acquainted. And would you like to start? And I always give the person who just got found the option. Do you want to start with a phone call? Do you want to start with a letter? Do you want to exchange photos? And she said, how about if I just send a letter first? And I said, that's fine. That's fine. And so she did that. And they did connect by letters. They sent photos. Of course, I told him, the boy, what the situation was. And eventually he traveled out there to California to meet his birth mom and her husband. And the next year, the two of them were able to make a road trip to Colorado to meet him and his young family. And they exchanged Christmas cards and birthday cards, and that's it. They don't have a lot in common, but they did have a reunion. And so they do know of each other, and there's concern. They just don't have a close relationship. But I think his curiosity and feeling of connection was satisfied, and she was so pleased at his life. And we come into the dating investigations. And this young woman came to me on a Saturday morning. And Levon was a public relations writer for a big corporation. She wanted a full background investigation on a man that she had met online. She'd been seeing him for 7 months, and she expected this relationship to lead to marriage. She wanted a background investigation only to put her mother's mind at rest, because her mother had doubts about this fellow. Now, personally, Levon was completely happy with him. We'll call him Joe. He was thoughtful and charming. He liked the same movies and music that she did. They'd go out at least once a week for dinner, and once in a while she would cook for him. He was polite and attentive to her mother and her sister. Levon said, this is the guy. He's a keeper. And I said, okay, well, we need to calm your mother down then. And I said, does anybody else have any concerns? She said, well, my sister thinks he might be hiding something. So I opened my notebook and I asked her for Joe's full name, age, occupation, address, and so forth. Levon could only answer a few of my questions. He worked for some government agency, but he wouldn't say which one. He implied that he had a high-level security clearance. She didn't know his home address. He'd never taken her to his house, but she knew that he lived with his elderly parents. She hadn't met the parents. I asked what she thought of Joe's friends, and she said, oh, I don't know any of them. He says he just likes spending evenings with me. I asked where he grew up, and she said, well, I don't know, in the Midwest somewhere. He just doesn't like to talk about his childhood. And then I asked my very favorite question. Levon, has Joe asked you to loan him any money? She looked surprised, but she said, well, yes, but not very much. See, he lost his credit card. And while he was waiting for the new one to come, he needed to pay for a car repair. It was a little thing. It was about $300. Okay, did he pay you back? Well, not yet, but it's only been a month or so. Levon was ready for me to take the case, and she pulled out her checkbook. I shook my head and I said, you don't need a private investigator, and I won't take your money. I can't meet your objective of calming down your mother. Your mom is right. This guy is being elusive, probably deceptive. All the red flags are there. In 7 months, you haven't been to his house. You haven't met his parents. You don't know his address. We don't even know if Joe is his correct name. You don't even know if he's married. He could have another family somewhere. Well, she was not happy, and she was very disappointed with me. And I don't think she wanted her mom to be right, but that's the way it is. And I figured that this guy, Joe, was just about as honest as the man who owned the Pearl of India. Here we are. So we do have time for some questions. If anybody has anything. Yes. Yeah, we would be paid similarly to lawyers. We are paid, we usually get a retainer up front, and then we charged by the hour. And so we would estimate a case at the initial meeting and say, locating this person will probably take 5 to 10 hours of work. It's going to be difficult. And then we're going to have some other expenses, data bank expenses for the different searches we'd have to pay for. And so we would ask for that initial retainer. And then if we don't use it all, we refund the half or whatever we didn't use. If we've used up that amount of money and the hours and expenses, then we wouldn't proceed again until we had authorization or another retainer. And because we worked for the lawyers, not for private individuals, it was very rare that we had a private individual. They were usually quite good about paying us, but that's how we were paid. But we didn't make as much money per hour as lawyers do, but we still did okay. And we had some subcontractors who worked with us, and they would work at a somewhat lower hourly rate, but not too low because we wanted to keep really good people with us. Yes.
Can you, your background, you're a journalist?
Right. Yeah, I went to the journalism school at the University of Denver, finished at the University of Colorado, worked a lot in radio, but my first husband was in radio, and I really need to do something else. So I had worked on the school papers, of course, high school and college. So I went ahead, did freelance writing for a while. And then when my children were all in school, I went to do work for the Denver Post. And I covered Boulder for the Denver Post at a Boulder bureau. So actually, my office was in my home, which is perfect for raising a family. I was very fortunate to have a full-time job actually in the newspaper guild. So I was in a union, and yet I was based at home. But I had odd hours. I'd be out at a city council meeting at night. I'd be at a trial during the day, press conferences, whatever. And then on the side, after a while, I started teaching at the University of Colorado School of Journalism. The Denver Post was sold, and in 1983, and the new owners from Texas were people that I just could not get along with. They wanted to close the Boulder bureau, had me work in Denver. I was going to be on a special, what they called the A-team. They were going to do the breaking news of the day. If there's a plane crash, we'd be there. If the governor resigned, we'd be there, whatever. And that lasted 2 weeks. And then they changed me to a different assignment. And I said, whoa, that's enough. And I quit. But then I did not have an occupation. And some of the lawyers that I knew from covering courts and things asked if I might want to be an investigator. And I had no idea. I didn't know what they did. I got in my car and I drove down to Bob Brown's office because he'd already left law enforcement. I knew he was a private investigator. I walked in on his office. He's back there with his feet up on the desk. I said, hey, yeah, Bob, what am I getting into if I decide to be a private investigator? He said, I was wondering when you might ask that. And so I left there with an arrangement to work for him up to about 20 hours a week. And the first day I helped him find a couple of witnesses that he couldn't find. And He had work in Denver, I had work in Boulder, and we put our agencies together eventually, and then we added an office in Albuquerque. And so I did that for a total of 22 years. Okay. Yes. No, no.
Are they as reputable as you might think?
Can't hear the question.
I personally would probably not choose a lawyer who advertised on television. There are lots of good lawyers. You can look at Martindale Hubble online, or you can look for Best Lawyers in America online. They're not going to charge any more. They all get about 1/3 of the settlement if they take your personal injury case. And 1/3, you say, that's a lot of money for them. But they're paying their office staff, they're paying experts, they're putting your case together, and they're generally your advocate to help you get better continuing treatment too. So the 1/3 is not totally unfair, but you get a lawyer from a referral from a friend, or if you have a lawyer who does your wills and things like that, say, who do I go to for my personal injury? And let them refer you to somebody reputable. All of the lawyers we worked for were very active in the Colorado Trial Lawyers Association. They were highly regarded, listed in the best lawyers in America, and they paid their bills on time. So very nice.
What TV shows do you watch?
Well, I don't. I don't care for any, I don't even like to read mystery books. I usually figure out what's happening before it's done. And I can't understand, I appreciate the entertainment value of TV, but you can't solve a case in an hour. Many of these things took weeks and weeks to resolve. Yes. Our agency is closed because we're retired. Yeah. Bob made a decision early on that even though he was in law enforcement, none of us were going to wear guns. And I had a couple of investigators who worked with me who were gun people, and they were astounded that I didn't even know the difference between a pistol and a revolver. So they took me out to a gun range to practice a little bit and learn so I could interview people about guns. But none of us ever was armed. What we would do is we would choose the time and place where we approached risky people. We would have a couple of us together. I did an interview one time for one of my clients that was a university, and they had a very volatile professor. They wanted to get his statement, and they had 2 of their police officers in the room next to me, and I had a pager. But I got along fine with the guy, and I got his story. But we were careful. We had a very, very difficult person I might even talk about if I come back next year, who was an informant in a drug case. We were really worried about him. So we arranged to meet him at one of our law firm places where there'd be a lot of people around. And we used one of their interview rooms, and that worked fine. So we just took precautions. I was in much more danger as a newspaper reporter than I was as a private investigator.
Okay, it's almost 10 o'clock. I have one short announcement. Someone paid their $2 dues with a $20 bill this morning, a woman, and you did not get.
We all,
Check with the back desk there, and